Let's throw out the Bible. As a matter of fact, let's get rid of every Christian writing that has ever existed. What kind of picture would history paint about Jesus if we only looked at independent, secular writings from historians of the same time period? Also, what does one of today's most prominent atheists have to say about the historical Jesus? After today's episode, if you consider yourself an intellectually honest and consistent person, you're only going to be left with two options. Coming up next. Welcome back. So first, let me start by saying this in no way, shape, or form is to imply that the New Testament of the Bible is historically inaccurate. In fact, the New Testament is more reliable and attested to than anything we are about to read here today. This is just to put an end to the Jesus mythicists. This is to show you that Jesus was a real person who really existed in history. That is a historical truth, whether you want to believe it or not. We're here at the end of the day to seek truth and factual information, and those things do not care about feelings. So today we're going to cover the works of several Greek and Roman historians, starting off with Phlegon. So a lot of Phlegon's work has been lost due to antiquity, but it has been preserved by the writings of the historian Origen. So basically that means that Origen quotes Phlegon's writings in his own writings. This happens frequently with historians. They deal with this all the time. So this is nothing that historians don't recognize. According to Bible Archaeology Report, this is not a problem for the historian, as many works have been preserved in the quotations of other ancient writers. So Phlegon was a Greek historian, and somewhere in the 2nd century, Origen quotes him saying, "And with regard to the eclipse in the time of Tiberius Caesar, in whose reign Jesus appears to have been crucified, and the great earthquakes which then took place, Phlegon too, I think, has written in the 13th or 14th book of his Chronicles." So this is our first source here today that mentions the eclipse and earthquake that happened during the time of Jesus's crucifixion under the reign of Tiberius Caesar. The second source here today about the darkness and earthquake occurring during the crucifixion of Jesus comes with Thallus. Thallus might have been the earliest non-Christian writer to mention Jesus, coming somewhere in the mid-1st century. Thallus's work has also been lost due to antiquity, but he is quoted in the writings of Julius Africanus. In his writings, he writes, "On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness Thallus, in the 3rd book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun." The context in Julius Africanus' writings shows that he's refuting Thallus' argument that the darkness is not religiously significant. So Thallus is writing this saying, yeah, an eclipse happened, but it was just an eclipse. It's not religiously significant. So this shows that enough people during that time were attributing this eclipse to something more significant to it just being a random eclipse. Next up, we've got Celsus, another 2nd century Greek historian. Celsus wrote a treatise attacking Christianity called The True Doctrine. And these works remain mostly, once again, through the quotations of Origen. Origen gives a rebuttal of Celsus's writings, noting that the critic used a literary device of imagining a Jew talking with Jesus. Origen writes about Celsus, "For he represents him disputing with Jesus and confuting him, as he thinks on many points, and in the first place he accuses him of having invented his birth from a virgin, and upbraids him with being born in a certain Jewish village of a poor woman of the country, who gained her subsistence by spinning, and who was turned out of doors by her husband, a carpenter by trade, because she was convicted of adultery. That after being driven away by her husband and wandering about for a time, she disgracefully gave birth to Jesus, an illegitimate child, who having hired himself out as a servant in Egypt on account of his poverty, and having there acquired some miraculous powers, on which the Egyptians greatly pride themselves, returned to his own country, highly elated on account of them, and by means of these proclaimed himself a God. So, all from this we get that Jesus was said to have been born of a virgin in a certain Jewish village of a poor woman whose husband was a carpenter by trade. And we get that Jesus spent time in Egypt and that he had some miraculous powers. However, Celsus just says that he got these powers from the Egyptians, since all those Egyptians are kind of mystical over there. And we get that Jesus proclaimed himself to be God. So that's the end of the quotation sources. Next, we'll go to Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman governor of Bithynia, who wrote to Emperor Trajan, asking for advice on how to deal with the Christians he was prosecuting. Pliny writes, "Others whose names were given me by an informer first said that they were Christians and afterwards denied it, declaring that they had been, but were so no longer, some of them having recanted many years before, and more than one so long as 20 years back. They all worshipped your image and the statues of the deities and cursed the name of Christ, but they declared that the sum of their guilt or their error only amounted to this, that on a stated day they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak and to recite a hymn among themselves to Christ, as though he were a god, and that so far from binding themselves by oath to commit any crime, their oath was to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, and from breach of faith, and not to deny trust money placed in their keeping when called upon to deliver it." This letter reveals that Christ was a real historical figure whose name the Roman magistrates were attempting to get the Christians to curse. It also shows that Christians during this time believed in the divinity of Christ. It's also important to note that Trajan's response to Pliny's letter was that Christians were not to be hunted out, but that those who claimed to be followers of Christ were to be punished, but those who recanted their faith were to be pardoned. In the end, it was all about worship, not that they had actually done anything wrong or harmful. Next up, we have another Roman historian, Suetonius. He writes in the 1st century. He explains the reason for the emperor's decision to expel the Jews from Rome. This event is also recorded in the Bible in the book of Acts. Suetonius says, "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christ, he expelled them from Rome." This reference demonstrates that within 100 years of Jesus' life, he was known to have existed and that he was a popular and controversial figure who caused disturbances amongst the Jews during the reign of Claudius, affirming the biblical record. Next up, we have Josephus, a Jewish Roman historian, and he has a very famous reference to Jesus in his works. Now, for the longest, the portion of this writing that we had contained pro-Christian vibes to it, so it was likely altered at some point by a pro-Christian scribe, and so historians kind of had to decipher how it was likely written. It had vibes in it saying that, he was the Christ, which doesn't make any sense for a Jewish Roman historian to have in there. But in 1970, archaeologists found the Arabic version of this passage that did not contain the pro-Christian interpolations, and it reads like this. "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders." Historian Paul L. Meyer notes, clearly this version of the passage is expressed in a manner appropriate to a non-Christian Jew, and it corresponds almost precisely to the previous scholarly projections of what Josephus actually wrote. Also in Josephus's writings, he mentions the death of Jesus' brother James. From this first century historian Josephus, we get the existence of Jesus. We get that he was called the Christ, who had good conduct, and he acknowledges that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and that many people became disciples, reporting that he was alive and had appeared to them. He also confirms the death of Jesus' brother James. And last but not least, we have Tacitus, the Roman historian, who left two major works. Tacitus's Annals give us a lot of what we know about the Roman Empire during this time period. And he writes early 2nd century, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So this passage affirms many details about Jesus, shows that he was called the Christ. This affirms his death under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. It shows the persecution of his disciples. And by mentioning this mischievous superstition, he most likely is referring to the belief that the early disciples said they saw Jesus risen from the dead. So, quick recap on everything we just went over from all of these sources. When you put the puzzle pieces together, you get Jesus's historical existence. You get that people referred to him as the Christ. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius Caesar. You get that there was an earthquake and an eclipse of the sun during the time of the crucifixion. You get that his disciples reported that he appeared to them after 3 days and they believed he was alive. That his followers were severely persecuted for doing no wrong. His followers worshipped him as God. He was said to have been born of a poor virgin in a Jewish village who was married to a man who was a carpenter by trade. He had miraculous powers, though they're saying he acquired them from the Egyptians. You get that he spent time in Egypt and that the Jews were expelled from Rome, and the death of Jesus's brother James. So yeah, man, this is all of the information we get, not even using the Bible, not using any Christian sources whatsoever. We still get all of this about Jesus existing historically. And as you see, all we gotta do is read the text. We don't have to make any crazy extrapolations. We don't have to pull any Jedi mind tricks. All we gotta do is just read and be honest with the text. And this is why I believe Jesus says, seek and you will find. And at the end of this, if you are a non-believer, I would say that you're left with only 2 reasonable choices to go from here. I would argue that this forces you to say, at bare minimum, that Jesus was a real person who existed in history. And if not, that's fine, you can deny it. But to be intellectually honest and consistent, also toss out everything else we know from antiquity. And this is the dangers of being a hyper skeptic, because at this point, what can you say that you really know, right? And we'll end this today with a quote from a prominent atheist today, Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman, on the topic of the historicity of Jesus, says, "This is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity. The reason for thinking Jesus existed is because he is abundantly attested in early sources. If you want to go where the evidence goes, I think that atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because frankly, it makes you look foolish to the outside world. If that's what you're going to believe, you just look foolish." All right, I know what you're thinking. You're probably like, all right, bro, I can get behind the fact that he existed as a real person in history, but that still doesn't prove anything. That doesn't prove that the New Testament writers were correct in everything that they wrote. I mean, that doesn't prove that he's God. And you're absolutely right. We've got a lot more to go through. The point is, at the end of this entire series, to put all of these puzzle pieces together, and you'll start seeing that picture come through. See you guys next time.